Hey everyone, this is Thendiel Swansong, author of the Final Fantasy XIV Dragoon Guide, How to Train Your Dragoon. In this video, what I wanted to do was walk through how to properly use Blood of the Dragon and Geirskogul, two of our core new Heavensward abilities as Dragoons. So if you've gotten the class to 60 and you've played around with things a little bit, you should have a good sense of the basics. Blood of the Dragon is a beneficial status effect that we really want to be active at all times, if possible. It boosts the potency of both jump and spine shatter dive by 30% while active, and it enables us to use these fourth combo hits, Fang and Claw and Wheeling Thrust. So anytime I use a True Thrust combo or an Impulse Drive combo, I'll randomly be allowed to use either Fang and Claw or Wheeling Thrust as my next GCD attack. Now, another consequence of using Fang and Claw or Wheeling Thrust is that they extend the duration of Blood of the Dragon by 15 seconds up to a hard cap of 30 for any one given moment. And that's good, because Blood of the Dragon is good, and we want it to be there and last as long as possible. On the other hand, Geirskogul subtracts 10 seconds from Blood of the Dragon's duration and translates it into a 200 potency off GCD attack. So it's a really interesting risk-reward arrangement. It's a trade-off between maintaining Blood of the Dragon to the maximum extent possible and sneaking in extra Geirskoguls for added potency while still doing that. So let's look at some of the fundamentals involved here. First of all, every time I use Blood of the Dragon, I want to make sure that it comes right before a Chaos Thrust or a Full Thrust. Any sooner, and I'm really wasting unnecessarily some of the timer. Additionally, I can use Geirskogul here. Anytime that I've freshly activated Blood of the Dragon, assuming 100% uptime on the boss, then it should be quite safe to use Geirskogul. Beyond this point, what we really need to do is pay close attention to the timer on Blood of the Dragon. So okay, it's at about 12 seconds now, and as I land this fourth combo hit, it reaches 23 seconds. So because of that, once I see that 23 second number, I know I'm safe to use a Geirskogul like I did just now. And in fact, the rule is going to be anytime the timer reaches 22 seconds or greater, I should be okay to use Geirskogul, as I mentioned before, assuming 100% uptime. Now, I'm going to break that rule a little bit here. I'm going to use an extra Geirskogul, and that's because Blood of the Dragon is coming off of cooldown. So I'm going to pop that here, and now I've kind of started the cycle over again. I can push out yet another Geirskogul as I transition into my new Blood of the Dragon timer. So if we're doing this correctly, what we should end up with is 3 Geirskoguls per minute, 3 Geirskoguls per Blood of the Dragon. But if you find that that's challenging, if you find that that mechanic is too frustrating, it shouldn't be too difficult to adopt a more conservative, more cautious standard for when you're using those. So, for example, I talk about how we're safe as long as the timer is at 23 seconds, 22 seconds or greater. Maybe you want to up that number. Maybe you want to say, okay, I'm only going to use Blood of the Dragon if my timer is at 26 seconds or more. So that's up to you. That wouldn't be the end of the world. You know, I won't say that it's optimum, because it's not, but your DPS isn't exactly going to plummet because you're pushing out something like 2 Geirskoguls per minute versus 3. The final thing that I want to mention here, as many of you have doubtless noticed and in some cases complained about, so in practice, this approach that I'm illustrating is really challenging to use. There are tons of mechanics in the game right now that just completely mess with our ability to smoothly execute the maximum Blood of the Dragon uptime, 3 Geirskoguls per minute ideal. So be aware that every fight is different, every fight becomes its own puzzle, where you're figuring out how to balance these two things, how to maintain Blood of the Dragon, and when it's okay to sneak in Geirskogul. So that should cover all of the essential principles for Geirskogul and Blood of the Dragon management. I hope that you found this video helpful.